Snow has a way of making everything feel quieter than it should. Sounds disappear, footsteps get buried, and familiar places suddenly feel empty. Most people think snowy nights are peaceful, something cozy, something calm. But when the snow falls late at night and the world shuts down, that calm can turn into something else entirely. The stories you're about to hear are all true, and they take place during snowy nights when visibility was low, help was far away, and silence felt intentional. Moments where the cold wasn't the only thing creeping in. A night when the snow refused to stop falling. A house where someone realized they weren't the only one awake. And a frozen street where something stood far too still in the snow. What makes these stories disturbing isn't what you can see, it's what the snow hides. The way it covers tracks, the way it muffles sound, the way it makes you feel isolated, even when you know people should be nearby. These aren't stories about monsters jumping out of the dark. They're about slow dread, quiet realizations, and the kind of fear that feels colder the longer it lingers. So if you're listening to this late at night, maybe take a look outside. Make sure the snow is really untouched, because these are 3 disturbing, true snowy night horror stories. And once the snow starts falling, some things are much harder to escape. The night the snow wouldn't stop falling. The snow started earlier than expected. At first it was light, the kind you barely notice. By the time night settled in, it had turned heavy, thick flakes falling nonstop, swallowing the road outside my house. I checked the time. 11:38 p.m. Weather alerts kept buzzing on my phone, warning people to stay indoors. Roads were closing. Visibility was dropping fast. I wasn't worried at first. I lived in a quiet area, but it wasn't remote. Help was never too far away. At least, that's what I thought. I stood by the front window, watching the street slowly disappear. The glow from the street light across the road looked dimmer every minute, the snow piling up beneath it. No cars passed. No footsteps disturbed the ground. It felt like the world was being erased. Around midnight, the power flickered, just once. Then everything went dark. The house fell silent, except for the wind outside, howling softly as it pushed the snow against the walls. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, telling myself the power would come back on soon. It usually did. I checked the front door to make sure it was locked, then glanced back at the street through the window. That's when I noticed something strange. The snow in front of my house looked different, not untouched. There was a long, narrow stretch where the snow hadn't settled properly, like something had disturbed it recently. I leaned closer to the glass, squinting through the darkness. The wind picked up, and fresh snow began to fall over it, slowly covering whatever had been there. I told myself it was nothing, just drifting snow, just uneven ground. But the feeling didn't go away, because whatever had been there wasn't moving anymore. And for the rest of the night, the snow never stopped falling. The power didn't come back on. I stood in the living room with my phone's flashlight on, listening to the wind outside as it pushed the snow against the house. Every so often, something would thud softly against the siding. Snow sliding off the roof, I told myself. Still, the house felt different without electricity. Smaller, tighter. I checked my phone signal. 1 bar. No internet. No service strong enough to make a call. I tried anyway. Nothing went through. I went back to the front window and wiped a small clear patch in the condensation with my sleeve. The street light across the road was barely visible now, its glow muted behind the falling snow. The road itself had disappeared completely, blending into the yard. That disturbed stretch of snow I'd noticed earlier was gone, completely covered. Fresh snow had erased it like it had never been there. I told myself that was normal. Snow falls fast in storms like this. Things disappear quickly. But something about how clean it looked bothered me. Too smooth, too deliberate. I turned away from the window and moved through the house, checking the back door and the side windows. Everything was locked. Everything was as it should be. That's when I heard the sound. A dull crunch. It came from outside. I froze, my flashlight aimed at the floor. Another crunch followed. Slow, heavy, footsteps. They weren't rushing. They weren't stumbling, like someone struggling through deep snow. Each step sounded firm, controlled, like whoever it was knew exactly where they were going. I stepped closer to the window again, heart pounding, and shined my flashlight toward the glass. The beam reflected back at me, useless against the darkness beyond. All I could see was swirling white and shadow. The footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Then they started again, closer. I backed away from the window, my pulse racing, and stood in the center of the living room, trying to listen over the wind. The sounds circled the house slowly. Crunch, pause, crunch, moving from the front yard toward the side. Whoever it was wasn't trying to hide. They were taking their time. I grabbed my coat and slipped it on, telling myself that if it was a neighbor, I could at least talk to them through the door. I reached for the front door handle, then stopped. The footsteps had stopped again, right outside the door. I stared at the handle, my hand hovering inches away. I imagined opening it to nothing but snow and darkness, the storm swallowing everything whole. Then, very softly, something brushed against the door. Not a knock, not a bang, just a light touch, like fingers dragging across the wood. I pulled my hand back instantly. The house went silent again, except for the wind. I didn't open the door. I didn't speak. I stood there in the dark, realizing something that made my stomach drop. Whoever was outside didn't need me to open it. They already knew I was home. I stood frozen in front of the door, barely breathing. The wind howled outside, but underneath it I could still hear something else, a faint, uneven crunch, like weight shifting in deep snow. Whoever was out there hadn't left. They were standing close enough that the sound carried through the door. I stepped back slowly, my eyes never leaving the handle. The house felt impossibly quiet without power. No hum of appliances, no distant noise from neighbors, just the storm and whatever was standing outside. I checked my phone again. 12:26 a.m. The battery was already low. I moved to the front window, careful not to make noise, and pulled the curtain back just enough to see outside. Snow blew sideways across the yard, thick enough to blur everything beyond a few feet. Then I saw it. A shape, not moving, standing where the steps had been. It was darker than the rest of the night, blocking the falling snow behind it. For a moment, my mind refused to process what I was looking at. I told myself it was a tree, or a shadow, or something the storm was creating. But trees don't stand that still, and shadows don't have depth. I watched as snow continued to pile up around its legs, slowly climbing higher. Whoever it was hadn't shifted once. They weren't brushing the snow away. They weren't reacting to the cold. They were just waiting. My chest tightened as I realized how long they must have been there. Long enough for the snow to gather like that. Long enough to know the house was dark. Long enough to know I hadn't opened the door. The shape tilted slightly. Not a step, just a subtle adjustment, like someone leaning forward. I let go of the curtain and stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I didn't want to see anymore. I didn't want to know what would happen if I looked again. That's when the sound came from the roof, a soft thud, then another, snow sliding off. But beneath it, something else followed, a scraping sound, slow and deliberate, moving from above the front door toward the side of the house. Whatever was outside wasn't leaving, it was moving. And for the first time since the storm started, I understood something that made my stomach drop. The snow wasn't trapping them outside, it was trapping me inside. I don't remember falling asleep. At some point, exhaustion must have taken over, because the next thing I knew, pale gray light was filtering through the windows. The storm had finally quieted. The wind was gone. The world outside looked still. I checked the time. 6:18 a.m. The power was still out. I stood up slowly and walked toward the front window, my legs stiff, my body heavy. Overnight, the snow had piled high enough to nearly bury the steps. Everything looked untouched, smooth, perfect. There were no footprints, no disturbed snow, no sign that anyone or anything had been standing there for hours. I stepped outside briefly, the cold biting through my clothes. The yard was silent. The road was still hidden beneath snow. It looked like no one had passed through all night, and yet something felt wrong. As I turned back toward the door, I noticed it. The snow piled against the front of the house had a narrow depression running straight up to the door, like something had stood there long enough for its body heat to melt the snow slightly before freezing again. It wasn't a footprint. It was a space. I went back inside and locked the door. The power came back on later that morning. Life slowly returned to normal. Plows arrived, cars passed, neighbors came outside. No one reported seeing anyone walking around during the storm. I lived there for another year after that night. Nothing like it ever happened again. But whenever it snows heavily now, I don't watch it from the window anymore, because I learned something that night. Snow doesn't just hide tracks. Sometimes it hides how long someone has been standing there, waiting. I was the only one awake during the snowstorm. The snowstorm had knocked everything offline by midnight. No cars outside, no wind anymore. Just silence. I checked the time on my phone. 1:12 a.m. Everyone else in the house was asleep. My parents had gone to bed hours ago, and my younger sibling's room had been quiet all night. Normally, that would have made me feel safe, familiar, relaxed. But something about the house felt wrong. The snow outside made everything quieter than usual. Sound didn't travel the same way. Even the walls felt thicker. I sat alone in the living room with only a small lamp on, scrolling through my phone, listening to the faint tick of the clock on the wall. That's when I noticed it. The kitchen light was on. I stared at it for a moment, confused. I was sure it had been off earlier. No one had gone downstairs since the storm started. I hadn't heard any footsteps on the stairs. No doors opening. Nothing. I stood up slowly and walked toward the kitchen, my socks sliding softly across the floor. As I reached the doorway, I noticed something else. The back door curtain was pulled aside, just a little, enough to see the white blur of snow outside. I stopped moving. No one ever touched that curtain at night. The back door was rarely used, especially during storms like this. I reached out and pulled the curtain closed again, telling myself someone must have forgotten earlier. The moment I turned away, the light flickered, once, then stayed on. I checked my phone again. 1:17 a.m. That's when it hit me. I hadn't heard anyone go back upstairs. And if I was really the only one awake, then someone else had been moving around the house without making a sound. I stood in the kitchen doorway longer than I meant to. The light stayed on. The curtain stayed closed. Nothing moved. I told myself to calm down. Snowstorms mess with your head. Power fluctuations. Old wiring. Familiar excuses I'd heard 100 times before. I turned the kitchen light off and walked back toward the living room, making sure my steps were quiet. I didn't know why, but suddenly it felt important not to make noise. I sat back down on the couch and glanced at the hallway that led to the stairs. Every door upstairs should have been closed by now. Everyone asleep. The house should have been still. A minute passed, then another. I was just starting to relax when I heard it. A soft click. It came from upstairs. Not a loud sound, not a footstep, just the faint, unmistakable noise of a door latch being released. I froze. I stared at the staircase, my heart beating faster as I waited for the next sound. I expected to hear footsteps, someone calling out, maybe one of my parents asking why I was still awake. Nothing came. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. I muted the TV. The sudden quiet made my ears ring. That's when I noticed the hallway light. It was on now. I hadn't turned it on. I was sure of that. I stood up slowly, every muscle tense, and took a step toward the hallway. The light cast long shadows along the walls, making the staircase look taller than it should have. "Hello?" I called out quietly. No response. I moved closer to the stairs and looked up. All the bedroom doors were closed. Too closed. The kind of closed that felt deliberate, like someone had made sure they were that way. I climbed the first step slowly, listening for any movement above me. Nothing. I reached the top of the stairs and stood there, heart pounding, surrounded by closed doors and silence. I leaned closer to my parents' bedroom door and listened. No snoring, no movement, no breathing. My stomach dropped. I backed away and hurried back downstairs, suddenly desperate to be anywhere but up there. I locked the front door again, even though it already was, then checked the back door. Locked. Everything secure. That's when I heard it again. A sound from upstairs. Not a door this time. A slow, careful step. Then another. Moving across the floor. Whoever it was wasn't rushing. They weren't trying to hide anymore. They were moving like they knew no one would stop them. I stood there in the living room, staring at the staircase, realizing something that made my chest tighten. If everyone else was really asleep, then whatever was moving around the house didn't belong there. The footsteps continued upstairs. Slow, measured, like whoever was moving didn't need to hurry. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, staring up into the hallway light. Every instinct in my body told me to wake someone up, to shout, to break the silence, but something stopped me. It felt wrong to make noise, like whatever was upstairs was listening. Another step echoed softly across the floor, then another. I watched the shadows at the top of the stairs shift slightly, stretching and shrinking as the light flickered. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then I heard something that made my chest tighten. Breathing. Not loud, not labored, just a quiet, steady breath coming from the hallway above. I slowly backed away, my heel brushing against the wall behind me. The sound upstairs paused, like whoever it was had noticed the movement. I didn't dare look away from the staircase. A shadow slid across the hallway floor at the top of the stairs. Not a full figure, just movement. I whispered my dad's name, barely louder than a breath. No response. The shadow shifted again, closer to the stairs now. I could feel my hands shaking as I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen lit up the room, just enough to make everything feel too exposed. That's when the breathing stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I stared at the phone screen, waiting for it to ring, for a message to come through. Anything to prove I wasn't alone in this moment. Nothing happened. Then, from upstairs, I heard a soft sound, a foot touching the top stair. The step creaked under the weight. Whoever it was had reached the staircase. I backed away until I felt the front door behind me. My body pressed against it. I didn't know what I'd do if they started coming down. The foot lifted. Another step creaked. They weren't rushing. They weren't hiding. They were descending. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart pounding in my ears, waiting for something to happen, for a voice, a face, anything. But when I finally opened my eyes, the staircase was empty. The hallway light upstairs was off. The house was silent again, except for the sound of my own breathing and the overwhelming feeling that whatever had been moving around the house hadn't left. It had just stopped, where I couldn't see it anymore. I didn't move for a long time. I stood there with my back against the front door, staring at the staircase, waiting for something to happen again. It didn't. The house stayed silent, frozen in that strange stillness the snowstorm had created. Eventually, exhaustion took over. When I woke up, pale daylight was filtering through the windows. The storm had passed sometime during the night, leaving everything outside buried and quiet. I checked the time. 7:04 a.m. The house felt normal again. Too normal. I walked upstairs slowly, half expecting to see something out of place. All the bedroom doors were open now. My parents were asleep. My sibling was still in bed. No one mentioned waking up during the night. When I asked if anyone had been downstairs, they all said the same thing. No, they hadn't heard anything. They hadn't gotten up. The storm had knocked them out early. I didn't argue. But as I went back downstairs, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The kitchen light was on. I was sure I'd turned it off. The curtain on the back door was pulled aside again, just enough to see the snow-covered yard beyond it. Outside, the snow was smooth and untouched, like no one had been there at all. I closed the curtain and turned off the light. Nothing else happened that day. But ever since that night, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't wrong. that I really was the only one awake, and that something else had been moving through the house while everyone slept. Because snow doesn't just make things quieter. Sometimes it makes it easier for someone to move around without being heard. Something was standing in the snow. The snow had finally slowed down sometime after midnight. Not stopped completely, just enough that the streetlights could cut through it again. I stood by the front window, watching the road outside my house disappear and reappear as flakes drifted past. I checked the time, 12:54 a.m. The street was empty, no cars, no people, just smooth, untouched snow, stretching in every direction. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world has shut down for the night. That's when I noticed it. At the far end of the street, near the intersection, something dark stood out against the white ground. At first I thought it was a mailbox or a sign half buried by snow, but it wasn't shaped right. I leaned closer to the glass, squinting to see through the falling snow. The shape was tall, narrow, upright. It didn't move. I watched it for several seconds, waiting for the wind to push it, or for snow to slide off, or for anything to change that would explain what I was seeing. Nothing happened. The streetlight nearby flickered softly, illuminating it just enough for me to tell one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't part of the street. It was standing on the road. I told myself it had to be a person, someone who'd gotten stuck in the storm, maybe waiting for a ride. But that explanation fell apart the longer I watched. No shifting weight, no brushing snow away, no movement at all. It just stood there, letting the snow pile up around it. I stepped away from the window, uneasy, then looked back again a few seconds later. It was still there, and that's when I realized something that made my stomach drop. It was closer than before. I stared at it longer than I should have. Whatever was standing in the road hadn't moved in any way that made sense. No shift of weight, no turning of the head, just a tall, dark shape against the white ground, perfectly still as snow continued to fall around it. I stepped away from the window again, my heart beating faster now, and paced the living room. I told myself not to look anymore. That staring at it was only feeding my imagination. But after a few seconds I went back. It was closer. Not by much, just enough that I couldn't explain it away. The shape now stood beneath the next streetlight, the dim yellow glow outlining its form more clearly. It was shaped like a person, tall, straight-backed, facing my direction. I felt my stomach tighten. If it was someone stuck in the storm, they would have moved by now. They would have waved, called out, done something to show they were alive and uncomfortable in the cold. This thing did none of that. I checked the time again. 1:07 a.m. I stood there, frozen, watching it as the seconds passed. Snow continued to pile up around its feet, but the figure didn't sink or shift. It just stood there, letting itself be buried. Then, slowly, it moved. Not a step, a turn. The shape adjusted just enough that I could tell it was now facing directly toward my house. I stepped back from the window, my chest tight, and turned off the lamp beside me. The room fell into darkness, leaving only the faint reflection of the streetlight on the glass. I waited a few seconds, then leaned forward again to look. It hadn't moved, but the distance between us was gone. The figure now stood across the street from my house, close enough that I could see the snow collecting on its shoulders and head. Still no movement, still no reaction to the cold. I backed away again, my heart racing. This wasn't someone lost. This wasn't someone waiting for help. This was something that knew exactly where it was going. I grabbed my phone and tried to record it, thinking that if I could capture it on video, I'd feel less crazy. The camera struggled to focus in the low light, the screen showing only blur and static. When the image finally sharpened, the street was empty. I lowered the phone and looked up. The figure was gone. I stood there, breathing hard, scanning the road, the sidewalks, the yards. There was nowhere it could have gone that quickly without leaving tracks. Then I noticed the snow. Fresh footprints had appeared, not leading away, leading straight toward my front door, and they stopped right at the edge of my yard. I stared at the footprints, my mind struggling to catch up with what I was seeing. They were deep, deliberate, pressed cleanly into the snow, each one spaced evenly apart, like whoever made them had walked calmly, without hesitation. They came straight down the middle of the road, crossed the sidewalk, and stopped just before reaching my front yard. They didn't continue. They didn't turn away. They just ended there. I backed away from the window slowly, my heart pounding, every instinct screaming at me to get as far from the door as possible. The house felt suddenly exposed, like the walls were thinner than they'd ever been. I checked the lock on the front door. Locked. I checked it again anyway. I turned off every light in the house and stood in the dark, listening. The snowstorm had quieted everything outside, but inside, every small sound felt amplified. My breathing, the soft creak of the floor as I shifted my weight. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Then I heard it. A faint crunch. Not from the road, from the yard. I held my breath, my eyes fixed on the front door. The sound came again, closer this time. Snow compressing under weight, careful, controlled. Whatever had been standing in the road was moving again. I felt my throat tighten as the sound reached the edge of the porch. I could picture it clearly, standing just outside the door, close enough that I wouldn't see it unless I looked. I didn't look. The house went completely silent. Then, very softly, something brushed against the front door. Not a knock, not a push, just a light scrape, like gloved fingers dragging slowly across the wood. My phone vibrated in my hand, nearly making me drop it. The screen lit up with a low battery warning, then went dark again outside. The scraping stopped. I waited, counting seconds, afraid that any movement would give me away. I expected a knock, a voice, something. Nothing came. After a while, I don't know how long, the crunching sounds moved away from the porch, slowly, one step at a time. I leaned toward the window again, just enough to see the yard. Fresh snow was already covering the footprints. By morning, there would be nothing left, and whatever had been standing out there would be gone. But the feeling stayed, the certainty that whatever it was hadn't come because it was lost. It came because it knew exactly where to stand. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the dark living room until the sky outside slowly turned gray, watching the front door like it might open on its own. Every so often, I'd glance at the window, half expecting to see that shape standing there again. When morning finally came, the storm was over. The world outside looked peaceful, clean, covered in untouched snow that sparkled faintly in the early light. I put on my coat and stepped outside, my boots sinking into the fresh snow. There were no footprints, none in the road, none in the yard, none on the porch. The snow looked exactly the way it should have, smooth and undisturbed, like no one had been there at all. I stood there for a long moment, trying to convince myself that meant something, that it proved I'd imagined the whole thing, that exhaustion and darkness had filled in gaps my mind couldn't explain. But as I turned back toward the house, I noticed something small that made my stomach tighten. The snow piled against the front of the door had been pressed down slightly, not enough to leave a clear mark, but enough to suggest something had stood there long enough for the snow to settle around it. It wasn't a footprint, it was a space. I went back inside and locked the door. Nothing like that ever happened again. No figures in the snow, no footsteps, no strange shapes under streetlights. But even now, when it snows late at night, I don't look out the window anymore, because I learned something that night. Sometimes, the most disturbing thing isn't what follows you. It's what stands perfectly still, waiting for you to notice.